Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 161 and it's titled Assassin's Speed, and that will make sense in just a moment. But if you haven't seen our show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Callison over on Reddit, and that card is Massacre Girl, the original Massacre Girl. There is, of course, a new one, but this is the original. She is 3 black for a 4/4 legendary creature human assassin. She has Menace, and when Massacre Girl enters the battlefield, each other creature gets -1/-1 until the end of turn. Whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until the end of turn. So, notably, as an unspoken rule on the channel, if we have a legendary creature or a card that is capable of being our commander as our random card of the week, then it does have to be our commander, because how else could we truly build around it unless we can try to get it into the command zone? So with that being said, let's jump right into some of our themes for this deck and immediately talk about what we're going to do to maximize the effectiveness of Massacre Girl. The first of those themes is going to be a little bit odd. It's going to be vehicles. And this is where the title of Assassin's Speed comes in, because Massacre Girl is going to wipe the board, leaving only the non-creature vehicles behind, and then immediately jump in a car and run over some of our opponents. And a kind of side tangent to this, I tried very hard to make sure that all of the vehicles in the deck had a crew cost of 4 or less, meaning Massacre Girl could immediately crew them when she hit the board. So that is also a minor theme that we're playing with as well. But to kind of lean into the vehicle theme, as an example, we have Surge Hacker Mech, which is 4 mana for a 5/5 vehicle. It's got Menace. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to twice the number of vehicles you control to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and it has crew 4. So this is super nice because it's a removal spell, and while it's not necessarily, necessary because we do have a board wipe in the command zone, it's nice to be able to remove something and then cast Massacre Girl on a later turn, so we don't necessarily have to spend the board wipe immediately. Plus, it's still just a 5/5 with Menace, which is perfect for what we want to be doing. It's a great way to get in damage and just kind of keep pushing in the late game. But that is only theme number 1. Theme number 2 has to deal with giving people tokens. Massacre Girl doesn't do much if she comes down and everyone's creatures are 2/2s, because now everything's getting -1/-1, nothing dies, and then that's it. We're done. So we want to use cards like Infernal Genesis to give our opponents tokens. And this is a great card to do that because it is 4 black for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player mills the top card of their library and then makes X 1/1 minion creature tokens, where X is that card's mana value. So Infernal Genesis, on its worst case scenario, everybody mills a land, there's no 1/1s, but the odds of that happening are pretty slim, and occasionally you'll run into someone who mills over, say, a 12 mana spell, a Galta or an Eldrazi, something like that, and just makes 12 1/1s, which means that when Massacre Girl comes down, there are 12 creatures dying, so everything is getting a minimum of -12/-12, and that's going to wipe out pretty much everything on the board, because this doesn't care about indestructibility, it doesn't care about hexproof, it's just wiping the board and then leaving the way open for Massacre Girl to jump in a car and just kind of start hitting people. So that is theme number 2. And then finally, the last theme of this deck is going to be artifacts. Because we're focused pretty heavily on vehicles, we want to make sure that we have ways to benefit from playing artifacts, and we got a lot of great cards for the mono black artifacts in the Necron Precon for the 40k decks, but one of the best cards for this is Anrakir the Traveler, which is 4 and a black for a 4/4 legendary artifact creature, Necron. and it has Lord of the Pyrian Legions. Whenever Anrakir the Traveler attacks, you may cast an artifact spell from your hand or graveyard by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So this is a great way to cast some of our bigger vehicles, and it's a great way to get them back from our graveyard, because if something dies in combat, or maybe we have to crew a vehicle in order to wipe the board with Massacre Girl, we just need that one more creature to die, we can then use Anrakir to get that vehicle back. So there aren't a ton of mono black artifact synergies, but there have been more and more lately, so there are some sweet tech cards that we can throw in here. But with that being said, let's move on from our themes and start to talk about some of our key cards. These are the cards that really synergize with what the deck is trying to do and really help push us toward a win con. So the first of our key cards is Genesis Chamber, and this doesn't look like much on face value, because it's, again, giving tiny tokens to our opponents and actually kind of benefiting the entire table. Typically, you see this card show up in group hug decks or in a deck that could actually tap the Genesis Chamber, so that way you don't have to give it to your opponents. But to explain what it does, it is a 2-mana artifact, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. So there's a couple of reasons why this is so important. The first one is we have no intentions of tapping the Genesis Chamber, so everyone's going to get to make 1/1s when their creatures enter the battlefield, but we really don't benefit from this that much. We don't have a ton of creatures, we just have a lot of artifacts, but we are able to fill the board with a bunch of 1/1s, particularly 1/1s on our opponent's side, and then cast Massacre Girl to wipe the entire board. And as a key point here too, it also gives us that 1/1 we need to start if for some reason everything on the board is a 2/2, because when we cast Massacre Girl, we then trigger Massacre Girl, but that also triggers Genesis Chamber, and we make a 1/1 before everything gets the -1/-1, so we're able to immediately start the chain if that's something we haven't been able to do up to that point. So Genesis Chamber really does a lot of what we want to do, and I think it definitely earns its spot here as one of our key cards. Next, though, our next key card that I want to talk about is going to be Reaver Titan. And Reaver Titan is a little bit of a weird one because it is just a massive creature and technically also a massive vehicle, because it is 7 mana for a 10/10 vehicle. It has Void Shield, so it has protection from mana value 3 or less. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 5 damage to each opponent, and it has crew for 4. So if we are attacking with Massacre Girl, we're just doing 4 damage. That's not quite what we want, but if we can drop a Reaver Titan, it enters, and then when we attack with it, because we can crew it with Massacre Girl, we're doing 5 damage to each opponent, plus an additional 10 to at least one opponent. Maybe we can attack multiple times with it. And it even has protection from mana value 3 or less, which is going to be most removal spells. Nobody can Swords to Plowshares it, nobody can Generous Gift it, nobody can Beast Within it. If this hits the board, it is incredibly difficult to deal with outside of a board wipe, and once someone casts a board wipe, it's no longer a creature because it's turned back into an artifact on our opponent's turns, so it really ticks all the boxes of what we want to be doing. And then finally, our last key card is going to be Canoptech Spider. And this is 5 mana for a 4/4 artifact creature spider. It's got flying, and whenever another non-token artifact creature or vehicle enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This is by far one of the best card draw engines we have in the entire deck, because it's just replacing every single vehicle we have. It basically says every vehicle just draws us an additional card. And we do have some artifact creatures, but for the most part they are just vehicles. So Canoptech Spider is going to be a great source of card advantage and a great way to really fill the board. And once we've cast our stuff, we've cast Massacre Girl, we've wiped away the board, yeah, we'll lose the spider, but the hope is that we've generated enough value up to that point that we're able to keep going. Or, on the other hand, maybe this comes down after we wipe the board and we're able to rebuild. So either way, Canoptech Spider is phenomenal for this deck and does exactly what we want it to be doing. Anyway though, moving on from our key cards, I want to touch on some of the cool interactions in this deck. And this is going to be cards that synergize well with each other, but in some cases are just fun and interesting cards that I wanted to highlight. So the first pair of cards I want to talk about is going to be between Death Pit Offering and Hangerback Walker. So Death Pit Offering is 2 black for an enchantment. As it comes into play, sacrifice all creatures you control. Then creatures you control get +2/+2. Normally that wouldn't be super good because we'd have to sacrifice all our creatures, but considering most of our creatures are vehicles, we just don't turn them into creatures, we don't have to sacrifice them, and then they're still going to get the permanent +2/+2. But this goes incredibly well with Hangerback Walker, which is XX for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters. When it dies, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker, and you can pay 1, tap, and put a +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. So the way that this would work is, say we play Hangerback for 3. We have 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and then we can cast Death Pit Offering, which is going to force us to sacrifice the Hangerback Walker, but then we get to make 3 Thopters, all of which get +2/+2, so now instead of having a 3/3, we have 3 3/3s, which is tripling our damage output. So this is a great way to really flood the board, and it's especially great if you can get Hangerback Walker into play early, keep putting counters on it, get it up to 5, 6, 7, and then cast the Death Pit Offering and just make a ton of giant Thopters. So very cool interaction that I didn't actually realize when I first put this deck together. It actually came up in one of my playtesting games, so definitely a very cool interaction. Next up, our next cool interaction is going to be between Cyberman Patrol and 3-Fold Thunder Hulk. So Cyberman Patrol is 2 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature Cyberman, and artifact creatures you control have Afflict 3. So whenever it becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. And we're going to partner that up with one of the best token generators in our entire deck, 3-Fold Thunder Hulk, because that is 7 mana for a 0/0 artifact creature gnome. It enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, we make a number of 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens equal to its power, and we can pay 2 and sacrifice another artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on 3-Fold Thunder Hulk. Now, the Afflict 3 doesn't seem immediately relevant when we're just attacking with a 3/3, because either they take the 3 or they block it and then still take the 3. But if we are flooding the board with a ton of gnome creatures, we can then make sure that you either take the 1 from the gnome or you take 3 when you block it. So at some point, our opponents are gonna have to start blocking, and then they're gonna have to start taking even more damage. So we're pretty much guaranteeing that we're hitting our opponents no matter what. And this is going to, again, fill the board with 1/1s that we can then wipe away with Massacre Girl when we get to that point. But this is a great way to make sure that we are constantly chipping in for damage and making sure that we can end the game when necessary with some of our vehicles. So those are all of our cool interactions. And so the last piece of this deck tech is to take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the deck price came in at $75.54, with the most expensive card in the deck actually being a land in Cabal Stronghold. It's $9 for this land, but it is incredibly powerful in the right deck, and this is one of them, because it taps for a colorless mana, but it can also pay 3, tap, and add a black for each basic swamp you control. Since we're a mono black deck, we have a ton of basic swamps, and as soon as we get to the point where we have 4 basic swamps, this is now tapping for a neutral amount of mana. Anything more than that just becomes a net positive. So Cabal Stronghold is definitely worth the inclusion when we want to ramp into vehicles and we want to ramp into Massacre Girl. But if you do need to trim out Cabal Stronghold just for budget purposes, you can replace it with a swamp, and it's going to function just about the same in most situations. On the other hand, though, if you're looking for a card that you want to put into the deck that's a little outside of our budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So the card that I would recommend putting into this deck, if you don't mind paying a little bit more, is the new Massacre Girl Known Killer, which is 2 black for a 4/4 legendary creature human assassin, has menace, creatures you control have wither, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. So once again, a huge card draw engine, especially when Massacre Girl can come down and take out 10, 20 creatures all at once, depending on how many creatures are in play. And we would get to draw a card for pretty much all of them. Now, obviously, this starts to go downhill because Massacre Girl will die to, well, I should probably rephrase. Known Killer will die to the original Massacre Girl once we hit 4 triggers, and then we stop drawing cards. But as long as we can get a little bit of value out of it before then, I definitely think it's earned its place. However, if you are putting in a card to the deck, you would have to take a card out, and the card I would recommend would be Inspiring Statuary. It's 3 mana for an artifact, and it says non-artifact spells you cast have improvise. Originally, when I put this in here, the goal was to tap the vehicles and tap the artifact creatures to be able to help cast the non-artifact spells. But in practice, I realized we didn't actually have that many non-artifact spells, and the ones that we did tended to have double or sometimes even triple black in their casting cost. So even tapping a couple of creatures didn't actually make that much of a difference, and I found myself really not using Inspiring Statuary because there were so few targets for it. That's not to say that Inspiring Statuary is not an amazingly powerful card, and it can really do a lot of work in the right deck. I just don't necessarily know if this is the right deck. So I think if you're putting in Massacre Girl Known Killer, I would recommend taking out the Inspiring Statuary. But that is it for the budget portion of our deck. And before we jump into a game, because of course we got to get a game in, see how this deck functions, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. And of course, give a huge shout out to our patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. To all of you, thank you all so much. And of course, if you are not a patron or channel member and would like to be, you can check us out on both of those places. But if you don't have the time, or maybe it's just not the time for you, I completely understand. Other than that, though, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit, and thank you so much for watching up to this point. But I don't want to ramble on too much about the self-plugs, so let's jump into a game with this deck and see how it actually functions. So this week, we are joined by 3 opponents, and we are going to be playing up against the new Massacre Girl Known Killer, being played by Bilal, the Wise Mothman, being played by Jason, and Aura Skyclave Hierophant, being played by Shawn. Starting off with Massacre Girl, this is Bilal's take on Massacre Girl, so it's very similar to our deck, except of course there's no vehicles because he doesn't want to drop a Massacre Girl and wipe the board. He instead wants to accrue a bit more value. So his goal is to play Massacre Girl and then keep draining out his opponent's creatures, keep dropping them to 1 or lower to just kind of draw a ton of cards and do some shenanigans with Wither and -1/-1 counters. So I imagine that even though we are trying to kill a lot of creatures, I think Bilal's deck is also going to be trying to kill a lot of creatures. So I do feel bad for the creature decks at the table, which does include Jason's Wise Mothman deck. And this deck actually is 100% the pre-con Wise Mothman deck. There are no changes to it. Every single card comes in the deck box. So if you are interested in seeing how that deck performs when matched up against some pre-built, or I guess pre-built is probably the wrong word, built by players rather than WotC, this is a great look for you. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Shawn and his Aura deck. I think out of all the decks at the table, this is the one that I'm the most concerned about, because more than anything else, Shawn has built so many ways into this deck to return clerics from his graveyard to the battlefield. It's all about clerics, it's all about reanimating, it's all about life gain, and those are all a ton of things that we are really going to struggle to deal with, because if we wipe the board and he just gets everything back, now we have Massacre Girl in play, we can't wipe the board again, and he can block our vehicles. So I do think Aura is going to be a really tough deck for us to take down, but we've seen Aura a couple of times on the channel. It's always a super sweet deck, and Shawn's build is very, very cool. So while I am the most concerned about that deck, I am also very excited to play against it again. So let me know down in the comments what your predictions are for the game. Let me know who you think might win, and then we'll see if you're right at the end. So thank you all so much for watching up to this point. Please do like and subscribe, and then let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Jason, and then Shawn. On my first turn, I play a Myriad Landscape. Bilal plays a Swamp. Jason plays an Island. Shawn plays a Bright Climb Pathway and casts Skull Clamp. I play a Swamp and cast Charcoal Diamond. Bilal plays a Swamp. Jason plays a Forest and casts Piper Wright Public Reporter, letting him investigate a number of times equal to the combat damage she deals to a player, and also lets him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever he sacrifices a clue. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Remorseful Cleric, which can sacrifice itself to exile target player's graveyard. I play a Swamp and cast Mindstone, and then also sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Bilal plays a Swamp. Jason plays a Forest and attacks me for 1 with Piper, making a clue when she deals combat damage. Then in his second main phase, he casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Shawn plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling my graveyard, then attacks me for 2 with Remorseful Cleric. In his second main phase, he equips the Remorseful Cleric with Skull Clamp, giving it +1/-1, and letting him draw 2 cards when it dies, which immediately does, so Shawn draws 2. On my turn, I play a Desert of the Glorified, then cast Thunderhawk Gunship, which makes 2 2/2 Astartes Warrior tokens when it enters the battlefield, and it also has Crew 2. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Massacre Girl Known Killer, giving all his creatures Wither and letting him draw a card when an opponent's creature dies with toughness less than 1. Jason attacks Shawn for 1 with Piper, making a clue when she deals damage. Then in his second main phase, he plays a Forest and casts his commander, the Wise Mothman, giving each player a rad counter when it enters or attacks, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on X creatures whenever X non-land cards are milled. On Shawn's turn, he mills a non-land card for his rad counter, losing it and losing a life, while Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. After that resolves, Shawn casts Arcane Signet and also casts Selfless Spirit, which can sacrifice itself to give all his creatures indestructible until the end of turn. On my turn, I mill a non-land card for my rad counter, removing it, losing a life, and letting Jason put a counter on Mothman. I then tap an Astartes Warrior to crew the Thunderhawk, using it to attack Jason for 6, while I also attack Bilal for 2 with the other Astartes. On attacks, the gunship gives the token flying so Bilal can't block, taking 2, and Jason chooses to save his commander, taking 6. In my second main phase, I cast Hangerback Walker for X = 4, putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and making 4 Thopter tokens when it dies. On Bilal's turn, he mills a land for his rad counter, so nothing happens. He then plays Takenuma the Abandoned Mire, and casts Liliana of the Dark Realms, activating her +1 ability to search his library for a swamp, putting it into his hand. On Jason's turn, he mills a land card for his rad counter, then plays an Exotic Orchard, and attacks Liliana for 5 with Mothman, giving each player another rad counter and killing the Planeswalker. Then, in his second main phase, Jason casts Strong the Brutish Thespian, now gaining life instead of losing life from his rad counters. On Shawn's turn, he mills a non-land with his rad counter, removing the counter and losing a life, while Jason puts a counter on Strong. Shawn then plays a Plains and casts his commander, Aura Skyclave Hierophant, so that whenever he or another cleric dies under Shawn's control, Shawn can return a cleric from his graveyard to the battlefield with mana value less than the clerics that died. When I mill for my rad counter, it's a non-land, so I remove the counter, lose a life, and Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Strong. I then play a Swamp, and tap an Astartes token to crew the gunship, then attack Bilal for 6 and Jason for 2, giving the token flying. In my second main phase, I cast Soul Ring, and then I also cast Sky Sovereign Consul Flagship, doing 3 damage to Piper when it enters, killing her. Then, at the end of my turn, Bilal pays 4 life to cast Dismember, giving my Hangerback Walker -5/5 until the end of turn. In response, I activate the Walker, putting another +1/+1 counter on it, and this doesn't save it, but it does let me make 5 Thopter tokens when it dies, while Bilal gets to draw a card with his commander. When Bilal mills for his 2 rad counters, he hits 2 non-land cards, losing 2 life, removing his rad counters, and letting Jason put a +1/+1 counter on Strong and Mothman. After that, he casts Demon of Dark Schemes, giving all creatures -2/2 until the end of turn, making an energy for each creature that dies. This kills a total of 7 creatures, so Bilal makes 7 energy and draws 7 cards thanks to Massacre Girl. In response, Shawn casts Village Rites, sacrificing Selfless Spirit to draw 2 cards. I also respond, sacrificing my Mind Stone to draw a card, then it resolves and Bilal moves to combat, attacking me for 4 with Massacre Girl. Notably, it should have only been 2 since she also gets -2/2. When Jason mills 2 for his rad counters, he hits 1 land and 1 non-land, gaining a life, losing a rad counter, and putting a counter on Mothman. He then plays a Nesting Grounds, casts Talisman of Resilience, and moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 9 with Strong, and me for 7 with Mothman, giving each player another rad counter. In his second main phase, Jason casts Watchful Radstag, which has Evolve, and whenever it evolves, Jason makes a token copy of it. When Shawn mills for his rad counter, he mills a land, then he plays a Plains, and equips Aura with Skull Clamp, giving him +1/-1, and letting him draw 2 when it dies, then he also foretells a card. When I mill for my rad counter, I mill a non-land, losing my rad counter, a life, and letting Jason put a +1/+1 counter on Strong. After that, I cast a Crow and Horse, giving control of it to Bilal, and letting each of his opponents make a 1/1 soldier token in his upkeep. Then, I cast Anrakir the Traveler, which lets me cast an artifact from my hand or graveyard by paying life instead of mana whenever it attacks. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills a non-land for his rad counter, losing it, losing a life, and each of his opponents makes a soldier token. He then plays Agadim the Undercrypt tapped, and attacks Jason for 4 with Massacre Girl. At the end of turn, Jason sacrifices his clue tokens, drawing 2 cards. Then, on Jason's turn, he mills 2 non-lands for his rad counters, gaining 2 life, losing both counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Strong. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 9 with Mothman, giving everyone a rad counter, and attacks Shawn for 12 with Strong. I use Anrakir to crew the Sky Sovereign, using it to block, while Shawn blocks with Aura, killing both creatures, letting Shawn draw 2, and return Remorseful Cleric from his graveyard to the battlefield. Since Strong was also dealt damage, he gets 3 more +1/+1 counters, and Jason gets 3 more rad counters. In his second main phase, he plays a Temple of Deceit, scrying 1, and casts Nightkin Ambusher, giving Shawn 4 rad counters when it enters, and this triggers Evolve on the Radstag, making a copy of it. When Shawn mills for his 6 rad counters, he mills 1 land and 5 non-lands, losing 5 life, losing 5 rad counters, and letting Jason put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman, Strong, the Nightkin, and both Radstags. After that, Shawn plays a Swamp, then equips his soldier token with the Skull Clamp, giving it +1/-1, killing it, drawing 2 cards, and letting Bilal draw a card. Once that's resolved, he casts Kaya's Wrath, destroying all creatures and gaining 1 life, since the board wipe destroys one of his own creatures. After that resolves, Shawn casts Animate Dead, returning Drana the Last Blood Chief to play, enchanted, and getting -1/-0. He plays a Secluded Step, which unfortunately he couldn't do as he's already played a land this turn, but we don't catch that at the time. On my turn, I mill a non-land card for my rad counter, removing the counter and losing a life, then cast my commander Massacre Girl, giving all other creatures -1/-1 until the end of turn. I use her to crew the gunship, attacking Shawn with it for 6. On Bilal's turn, he mills a non-land card for his rad counter, removing it and losing a life, then cast Cryptghast, letting all his swamps tap for an additional mana, and it also has Extort. He then casts Twilight Prophet, revealing the top card of his library in his upkeep, putting it into his hand and making each opponent lose life equal to its mana value while he gains that much life, but only if he has the City's Blessing, which he currently doesn't. He does Extort with Cryptghast though, making each opponent lose a life while Bilal gains 3. When Jason mills for his rad counters, he hits 1 non-land and 3 lands, losing a life and removing a counter. He recasts his commander Mothman, giving each player a rad counter, then cast Bloatfly Swarm, entering with 5 +1/+1 counters, and if damage would be dealt to it, it's prevented and that many counters are removed from it instead, then each player gets that many rad counters. When Shawn mills for his 2 rad counters, he hits a land and a non-land, losing a life and removing a rad counter, while Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. Shawn then casts a Felwar Stone and attacks me for 3 with Drana, triggering her ability, so I get to choose a non-legendary creature from his graveyard to return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, and in this case I choose Selfless Spirit. In Shawn's second main phase, he casts Whisper Blood Liturgist, which can be activated to sacrifice 2 creatures and return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield. On my turn, I mill a non-land with my rad counter, removing it, losing a life, and letting Jason put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. I then cast Mobile Garrison, which has Crew 2, and can untap another creature or artifact when it attacks. I use Massacre Girl to again crew the Thunderhawk gunship, and attack Bilal for 6. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Barad-dûr, then casts Caged Sun, extorting it so each of his opponents lose a life while he gains 3, and names black when it enters so all his black creatures get +1/+1, and his lands that produce black mana produce an additional mana. We also remember his rad counters, so he mills a non-land, losing a life, removing his rad counter, and Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. After that, Bilal casts Phyrexian Obliterator, making any player sacrifice permanents equal to the damage they deal to it. When Jason mills for his 4 rad counters, he mills a land and 3 non-lands, losing 3 life, removing 3 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and the Bloatfly. He casts Power Fist, equipping it to Mothman, giving it trample and putting +1/+1 counters on it equal to the combat damage it deals to an opponent, then attacks Bilal for 4 with Mothman, giving each player a rad counter, and Bilal blocks with Twilight Prophet, taking no damage. In his second main phase, he casts Vexing Radgull, giving a player 2 rad counters when it deals combat damage to them, or proliferating instead if they already have a rad counter. He also casts Raoul Troubleshooter, letting him cast a spell from his graveyard that was milled this turn, but only once each turn. When Shawn mills for his 2 rad counters, he mills a land and a non-land, removing a counter, losing a life, and then Jason puts a counter on Mothman. Shawn then moves to combat, attacking me for 3 with Drana, triggering her ability, and this time I choose to return Fiend Hunter from his graveyard to the battlefield. When it enters, he exiles Cryptghast until it leaves the battlefield, but with the trigger on the stack, he activates Whisper, sacrificing the Fiend Hunter and the Selfless Spirit to return Sun Titan from his graveyard to the battlefield. Notably, since the Fiend Hunter was sacrificed before it could exile the creature, the return trigger resolves first, meaning the Cryptghast is permanently exiled. Then, when Sun Titan enters, he returns Fiend Hunter from his graveyard to the battlefield, this time exiling Bloatfly until it leaves. After that, he casts Leonin Relic Warder, exiling Caged Sun until it leaves the battlefield. Before the end step though, Bilal casts Tragic Slip, giving the Relic Warder -13/-13 since a creature died this turn, killing it and getting his Caged Sun back. After that, Shawn equips Skull Clamp to Sun Titan, giving it +1/-1 and letting him draw 2 cards when it dies. On my turn, when I mill for my Rad counter, I hit a non-land, removing my counter, losing a life, and Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. I then use Massacre Girl to crew the gunship, attacking Bilal with it for 6. In my second main phase, I cast Infernal Genesis, making each player mill a card in their upkeep, and then letting them make a number of 1/1 minion tokens equal to the milled card's mana value. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills a Merciless Executioner, making 3 minion tokens, while Jason puts a counter on the Rad Gull, reveals a Massacre Girl with Twilight Prophet since he now has the City's Blessing, making each opponent lose 5 life while he gains 5 life, then he mills for his Rad counter, milling a non-land, removing the counter, losing a life, and Jason puts another counter on Mothman. Once all of that has resolved, Bilal casts Hoarding Broodlord, searching his library for a card, exiling it face down, being able to cast it from exile, and giving spells he casts from exile Convoke. This lets him cast Bolas's Citadel from exile, letting him look at the top card of his library and play it by paying life instead of mana. He then pays 3 life to cast Nest of Scarabs, making a 1/1 insect token for each -1/-1 counter he puts on a creature. In response, Shawn casts Generous Gift, destroying the Citadel and letting Bilal make a 3/3 elephant token. After that resolves, Bilal casts Feed the Swarm, destroying Whisper and losing 4 life. In response, Shawn casts his Foretold Glorious Protector, exiling Whisper when it enters until the Protector leaves the battlefield. This causes Feed the Swarm to fizzle, so Bilal doesn't lose the 4 life. In Jason's upkeep, he mills an Alpha Deathclaw, making 6 minion tokens, putting a counter on Mothman, and then mills for his 2 Rad counters, hitting a land and a non-land, removing a Rad counter, losing a life, and putting another counter on Mothman. He then activates Raoul, making each player mill a card, and since 3 of them were non-lands, he gets to put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman, Raoul, and the Rad Gull. Then, since Jason milled the Casualties of War this turn, he's able to cast it from his graveyard thanks to Raoul, destroying Skull Clamp, Nest of Scarabs, Agadim the Undercrypt, and Sun Titan. Once that resolves, Jason attacks Shawn for 9 with Mothman, giving everyone a Rad counter, and me for 3 with the Vexing Rad Gull. Shawn blocks with the Glorious Protector, killing it, returning Whisper to play and only taking 5, while I take 3 and Jason gets to put 5 more +1/+1 counters on Mothman, then proliferates with the Rad Gull. In his second main phase, he plays a Viridescent Bog and casts the Master Transcendent, giving Bilal 2 Rad counters when it enters, and also letting him tap it to put target creature that was milled this turn onto the battlefield, except it's a 3/3 mutant. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills a High Priest of Penance, making 2 minion tokens, then mills 3 non-lands for his Rad counters, removing all 3 of them, losing 3 life, and Jason puts 2 total +1/+1 counters on Mothman, as well as 1 on the Rad Gull and another on Raoul. Once that resolves, Shawn casts a Soul Ring and activates Whisper, sacrificing both minion tokens to return Glorious Protector from his graveyard to the battlefield, exiling all of his other creatures when it enters, returning them to play when it leaves the battlefield. Since this exiles the Fiend Hunter, it returns Bloatfly Swarm to play under Jason's control as well. After that, Shawn casts a Merciless Eviction, exiling all creatures. In response though, I cast Hagra Mauling, destroying Glorious Protector so that all of Shawn's creatures re-enter the battlefield before the board wipe resolves, and his creatures are exiled as well. The only exception to this is Whisper, which he exiles with Fiend Hunter when it enters, allowing him to return after the Hunter is exiled. Finally, Shawn casts Doomed Necromancer and passes. In my upkeep, I mill Okiba Reckoner Raid, making 1 minion token, then I mill a land and a non-land to my 2 Rad counters, removing one of the counters and losing a life. After that, I play a Buried Ruin, immediately sacrificing it to return Night Paladin from my graveyard to my hand, casting it and doing 4 damage to each opponent when it enters the battlefield. I then tap the minion to crew the Night Paladin, and tap the Night Paladin to crew the gunship, using it to attack Shawn for 6, putting him to only 1 life. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills a Toxic Deluge, making 3 minion tokens, and also mills 3 non-lands and 1 land for his rad counters, removing 3 rad counters and losing 3 life. He then recasts his commander Massacre Girl, and after that he cast the original Massacre Girl, giving all other creatures -1/-1 until the end of turn, and repeating this process whenever a creature dies. This results in all other creatures on the battlefield dying, and Bilal draws 6 cards with his commander. He then plays a swamp and passes. In Jason's upkeep, he mills Agent Frank Horrigan, making 7 minion tokens, then mills 2 non-lands and a land for his rad counters, removing 2 of the rad counters and losing 2 life. He then recasts his commander Mothman, giving each player a rad counter. He equips Mothman with the Power Fist, and at the end of turn, Bilal casts Erebos' Intervention for X = 5, giving Mothman -5/-5 until the end of turn, killing it while Bilal gains 5 life. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills a Swords to Plowshares, making 1 minion token, then mills a land for his rad counter, staying in the game. He casts a Soul Warden, gaining a life, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, and cast Voice of the Blessed, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he gains a life, which he immediately does thanks to the Soul Warden, putting a counter on the Voice. He then recasts his commander Aura, gaining a life and putting another counter on the Voice. In my upkeep, I mill a Murderous Rider, making 3 minion tokens while Shawn gains 3 life and puts 3 +1/+1 counters on Voice of the Blessed. Then I mill 2 non-lands for my rad counters, removing the counters and losing 2 life. After that, I tap all 3 of my minions to crew the Paladin and the gunship, using them to attack Jason and Bilal both for 6, giving the Paladin flying so neither of them can be blocked. In my second main phase, I play a Swamp, and then cast my commander, Massacre Girl, gaining Shawn a life and putting a +1/+1 counter on Voice of the Blessed, but then giving each other creature -1/-1 and repeating this process whenever a creature dies. Since there are 11 minion tokens in play, this is more than enough to kill all creatures in play, including the creatures Shawn would get back with Aura. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills Sheoldred the Apocalypse, making 4 minion tokens, but unfortunately, he mills 1 non-land and a land for his rad counters, removing 1, losing a life, and getting irradiated out of the game. In Jason's upkeep, he mills Harmonize, making 4 minion tokens, then mills 2 non-lands for his rad counters, losing both counters and losing 2 life. He cast Winding Constrictor, so whenever he or his creatures would get a counter put on them, they get an additional one of those counters as well. After that, he cast Lily Bowen, Raging Grandma, entering with 3 +1/+1 counters and doubling the counters on herself in Jason's upkeep. He equips Lily with the Power Fist, then passes. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills an Edgewalker, making 3 minion tokens, then mills a non-land for his rad counter, removing it and losing a life. He plays a Witch's Cottage tapped, then cast Bishop of Rebirth, returning a creature with mana value 3 or less from his graveyard to the battlefield whenever it attacks. In my upkeep, I mill a Commander Sphere, making 3 minion tokens, then tap Massacre Girl to crew the mobile garrison, using it to attack Jason for 3, untapping Massacre Girl when it attacks, and Jason blocks with one of his minions, killing it and taking no damage. In my second main phase, I cast Mighty Servant of Lyoku, and then I pass. In Jason's upkeep, he mills Contaminated Drink, making 2 minion tokens, and doubles the counters on Lily up to 6. He attacks Shawn for 6 with Lily, and he blocks with all of his creatures, but before damage, he flashes in Dictate of Erebos, making it so that whenever one of his creatures die, each opponent has to sacrifice a creature. This kills Lily, the Bishop, and 2 minions, making Jason and I both sacrifice 3 creatures, killing 3 more minions for each of us. Then in his second main phase, Jason recast his commander Mothman, giving each player a rad counter, even getting an extra for himself thanks to the Winding Constrictor. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills a Path of Ancestry, not making any minions, then mills a land for his rad counter. He recast his commander Aura, and also cast Bygone Bishop, investigating whenever he cast a creature with power 3 or less. In my upkeep, I mill a swamp, making no minions, then mill a non-land for my rad counter, removing it and losing a life, while Jason puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Mothman. I then play a swamp and pass. In Jason's upkeep, he mills an Atomize, making 4 minion tokens, putting 2 more counters on Mothman, then mills a land and a non-land for his rad counters, removing one of them, losing a life, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on a minion. He equips Mothman with the Power Fist and attacks me for 2 with Winding Constrictor and a minion, knocking me out of the game, and attacks Shawn with Mothman and the rest of his minions, giving everyone a rad counter. Shawn is able to block enough damage to go to only 2 life, triggering Aura when his Bygone Bishop dies, returning Soul's Attendant from the graveyard to the battlefield. Unfortunately, when Shawn draws for turn, he's unable to find a way out of the Mothman beatdown, so he decides to concede, winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I definitely called it early on that there were going to be a lot of deaths in this game. A lot of creatures died. There were quite a few board wipes. Multiple Massacre Girls came down, both from myself and from Bilal. And then there was, of course, the reanimation from Shawn's side, doing what the clerics wanted to do. But in the end, it actually wound up being Jason's Mothman precon that took down the game. And if you've been paying attention on this channel recently, you'll notice that Jason really has quite the string of victories going with precon decks. That tends to be his specialty. Almost every time he rolls up to a game with a precon, everybody has to take notice. So very cool showing by everything that's going on. I think our deck performed well. I think that we struggled a bit. It was tough to see in the video, but throughout the course of the game, I milled a non-land to our rad counters almost every single time, and then proceeded to keep drawing lands. So I kept milling the non-lands and drawing more lands, and we really flooded out pretty hard, and I couldn't find a way to get out of it. Even still, we almost won the game. At the very end, if I had been able to hit just a single creature with the mill, you know, the one time I want to mill a non-land, I actually mill a land, I could have crewed multiple vehicles, including the Mighty Servant, to draw more cards and try to claw our way back into it. But not quite the case for us this time, even though I do think the deck still showed pretty well. So hopefully it was an interesting deck tech for you and an interesting video. I know it was a bit of a long one, so let me know down in the comments what you think. Let me know if there's any cards you think should be added or taken out of the deck. And of course, let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos as well. So with that all being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.